This committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up 5 measures, and I want to begin by thanking all of our committee members and staff on both sides of the aisle for the extensive preparation that went into today's markup. We appreciate the long hours, including those subcommittees that held their own markups. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements for the record. As all members were previously noticed, we now intend to consider en bloc 5 measures and amendments provided to your offices earlier this week. And so without objection, the following items are going to be considered en bloc. H.R. 3398, the Girls Count Act, with a Shabbat Amendment number 50 in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3398. The Manager's Amendment number 53 to that amendment. Then we have H.R. 5041, the Naphtali Frankel Rewards for Justice Act, along with the Royce Sherman McCall Engel Amendment number 130 in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4411. We have H.R. 5235, the Emergency Iron Dome Replenishment Act, with the Engel-Royce Amendment, number 62, in the nature of a substitute to that H.R. 5235. We have House Resolution 281, expressing concern about forced organ harvesting in the People's Republic of China. And we have the Manager's Amendment, number 129, in the nature of a substitute to that House Resolution 281. We have House Resolution 683, lastly, on the urgent need to protect religious minorities in Iraq. And we have the Poe Amendment number 95 to House Resolution 683. And after opening remarks by myself and the ranking member, I will be glad to recognize any member seeking recognition to speak on the en bloc items here. Nearly 1/3 of children around the world have never had their births registered. 1/3. And this has resulted in whole populations of children growing up in the shadows, not formally recognized as members of their society. These children cannot prove their age, their parentage, their citizenship, and that, of course, complicates their ability to attend school or receive health services. For girls in particular, a lack of documentation can undermine existing legal protections against their being trafficked or made child brides. And as they grow up, girls without an official identity face especially high barriers to education and to entrepreneurship. And that is why I want to recommend, and to all of you, that you take a look at Representative Shabbat's work here on House Resolution 3398. It is called the Girls Count Act. This bill supports efforts to increase birth registration worldwide by encouraging the State Department and the USAID to work with countries on improving their civil registries. The bill also encourages the development of laws and policies to prevent discrimination against girls and to improve property and inheritance rights for women. I encourage all members to support this good bipartisan measure. Next, we consider the Naphtali Frankel Rewards for Justice Act of 2014, introduced by Mr. Lamborn and by Mr. Sherman. On June 12, 2014, 3 Jewish teens were kidnapped and murdered by Hamas terrorists. One of the boys, Naphtali Frankel, was a dual American citizen. While Israel battles Hamas rockets from Gaza, Israeli security forces are searching for the perpetrators of these brutal killings. I have met with a family member of one of these young men. These killers must be brought to justice, and we should be doing all we can to assist Israeli authorities to ensure that that happens. To that end, this legislation endorses the use of the State Department's Rewards for Justice program in consultation with Israeli authorities to assist in this case. The Department considers the program to be a key tool in fighting terrorism, and it could help in this case. Importantly, this legislation also includes important language from Mr. McCall to ensure that the committee is kept fully informed about developments with the rewards program. Next, I want to thank Ranking Member Engel for his leadership in authoring H.R. 5235, the Emergency Iron Dome Replenishment Act. Scores of Israeli civilians were killed in their country's 2000 conflict with Hezbollah. I remember well the rockets slamming into Haifa when I was there. I went down to the Rambam Trauma Hospital. There were 600 victims in that one hospital alone. This was all a result of the Iranian and Syrian-made rockets that the terrorist organizations used to target Israeli civilians. Today, Hamas is engaged in a similar murderous effort with its rocket attacks at Israeli communities, again, provided by Iran, but in this case with very little success, thanks to Israel's Iron Dome anti-missile defense system. With the Iron Dome, Israel has reportedly intercepted Hamas's missiles with a once unthinkable success rate of 90%. This has allowed Israel to safeguard its population centers, its neighborhoods, its schools, and its hospitals. These are the targets of the attack, not military installations. These rocket attacks, missile attacks, always come on civilian targets. And that has saved innocent lives. Thus, we stand today not in support of continued U.S. assistance to Israel for the Iron Dome, but with legislation to ensure that this system is well supplied and equipped to handle future threats. And I want to thank the ranking member again for leading this important bipartisan bill, which I'm proud to co-sponsor. In turning to House Resolution 281, the promotion of human rights is a task the committee takes very seriously. Regardless of where the violations occur, it is our solemn duty as members of this committee to speak up and fight for human dignity and for respect. In the People's Republic of China, the horrendous practice of forced organ harvesting continues unabated. We know that prisoners sentenced to death, regardless of whether they received a fair trial or not, are forced to sign a piece of paper that supposedly demonstrates their informed consent. We also know that the Communist Party of China has undertaken a severe and brutal crackdown of Chinese citizens, whose only crime is to exercise their natural right to practice religion. House Resolution 281, authored by Chairman Emeritus Ross Leitonen, condemns the practice of forced organ harvesting in its entirety and calls on the government of the People's Republic of China to permit a transparent and independent investigation of their organ transplant system. The resolution also encourages the State Department to include greater detail on forced organ harvesting in its current reporting. Finally, just as importantly, this resolution encourages medical professionals to educate their patients about the dangers of transplant tourism. The amendment in the nature of a substitute, the manager's amendment here, builds upon the changes made by the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee. These changes are non-controversial and have the support of Falun Gong practitioners. And I want to thank my colleagues, Mr. Chris Smith and Mr. Dana Rohrbacher, for your helpful input. Finally, we turn to House Resolution 663, introduced by Mr. Vargas from California. This committee and the Terrorism and Middle East subcommittees have been very active on the crisis in Iraq. For months, we have sounded the alarm to the administration over ISIS's increasing strength and threat that ISIS poses to Iraq, to the region, and to U.S. interests. Allowing terrorists to grow to military strength has real deadly consequences, and few are feeling the terror of that reality more than the Christians of Mosul. Mosul Christians have worshipped in the city for over 1,600 years, but they now have been given an ISIS ultimatum: convert or die. Most have fled to Iraqi Kurdistan, where they continue to live in jeopardy. This resolution reaffirms Americans' commitment to the universal right of religious freedom for all and urges the U.S. Department of State and the Kurdish regional government and the Iraqi government to protect groups facing such peril under the current ISIS offensive. I now would like to go to our ranking member, Mr. Elliot Engel, of New York, for his remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this important markup. Thank you for the bipartisan collaboration you've brought to all of these measures, and for working with me on what I consider a vital measure, the Emergency Iron Dome Replenishment Act. Since early June, Hamas and other terrorist groups have launched thousands of rockets against Israeli civilian population centers, as well as Ben Gurion Airport and the Israeli nuclear reactor at Dimona. In this time, the Iron Dome anti-missile defense system has intercepted 492 rockets. At $82,000 per interception, Israel has spent more than $40 million in 6 weeks. The Iron Dome is Israeli developed but American financed, and our financing is vital to the safety of the people in Israel. The Secretary of Defense recently requested $225 million in supplemental funding for Iron Dome. The Senate Appropriations Committee has introduced legislation that fully funds this request. It is time for the House to do the same. I hope that this authorization language puts us on the path to meeting Israel's needs when Israel needs us most. I support the Royce amendment to this legislation. This provision focuses on a replenishment strategy for all of Israel's missile threats, whether they be from Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, or Iran. The amendment also adheres to the recent agreement between the United States and Israel to begin co-production of Iron Dome interceptors and other components. I once again thank you, Mr. Chairman, for working with me on this legislation and urge my colleagues to support it. Let me next thank Representative Chabot for introducing the Girls Count Act. Around the world, over a third of children under the age of 5 have no registration of their birth. You know, it's interesting because I remember my grandmother, who was born in Europe, telling me that she didn't have a birth certificate, and when I asked her what her birthday was, she wasn't quite sure. She said she thought it was sometime in December. So most of these children are girls. Someone who doesn't exist on paper faces particular vulnerabilities. They often can't get official documentation, and they become easy targets for child labor, human trafficking, and child marriage. H.R. 3398 will ramp up efforts to get more children registered. It authorizes the State Department and USAID to work with local governments to ensure equal access to registration programs. Getting children registered at birth helps get them off to a good start, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I also support H.R. 5041, the Naftali Frankel Rewards for Justice Act. Naftali Frankel was an Israeli-American teenager who loved basketball, music, and ping pong. He was on his way home from school when 2 Hamas terrorists kidnapped and murdered him and 2 other Israeli teenagers. The Israeli Defense Forces, partnering with the Palestinian Security Forces, searched for the teenagers for weeks in Operation Brother's Keeper. Israeli authorities named 2 suspects. Both belong to Hamas. We must use every tool we have to find Naftali's murderer. To this end, this bill would authorize the Secretary of State to offer and pay a reward to anyone who furnishes information leading to the arrest or conviction of an individual for their role in Naftali's kidnapping or murder. Again, Naftali was an American citizen, so we have extra special reason to be concerned about this. I'd like to commend Representatives Lamborn, Sherman, and McCall for their work on this important issue. I also support HRES 281, introduced by my friend Ileana Ross-Lehtinen, and the Royce Amendment to that resolution. This measure shines a light on disturbing allegations that China has engaged in organ harvesting from prisoners, including Falun Gong practitioners and ethnic Uyghurs. Forced organ harvesting is an unconscionable violation of human rights. The targeting of individuals based on their faith or ethnicity is equally deplorable and must not be tolerated. In 2012, Chinese authorities committed to ending the practice of transplanting organs from executed prisoners. Last year, the government announced plans to create a voluntary organ donor system. But today, we have no evidence that China is living up to its word on either count. I hope the State Department will continue its good work of reporting on human rights practices in China, including allegations of organ harvesting from political prisoners. And finally, I'd like to thank Representative Juan Vargas for introducing HRES 663, expressing the urgent need to protect religious minorities in Iraq from persecution by ISIS. Last month, the leadership of ISIS announced that the Christians of Mosul, Iraq's second largest city and one of the world's oldest Christian communities, must convert to Islam, pay a protection tax, leave, or face execution. Understandably, most of Mosul's 35,000 Christians are fleeing to territory controlled by the Kurds. People of all faiths should be alarmed by the situation in Iraq. This measure reiterates our commitment to the protection of religious freedom and calls on the State Department to work with the international community to help find safe havens for those trying to escape ISIS. It also calls on Iraq to establish a special representative for religious minorities. As thousands suffer under the brutality of ISIS, we need to look for ways to protect the basic rights and dignity of all Iraqis. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for holding this markup and for working with us in a bipartisan manner.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go now to members seeking recognition. I see Eliana Ross-Layton, the chairman of the legislation condemning the practice of forced organ harvesting on the part of the government of the People's Republic of China. I'll recognize her.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank you and Mr. Engel for bringing forth these measures today, including House Resolution 281, which I introduced last year, calling on China to end its inhumane and gruesome practice of organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience, especially the Falun Gong. The communist regime in China has been engaged in a violent and targeted campaign against Falun Gong spiritual practitioners. These individuals who promote truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance are being detained in re-education and labor camps, in detention centers, in prisons, where they are routinely tortured, abused, and beaten. And then they are executed by the regime for their organs in what has to be one of the most egregious and unimaginable violations of the right to life. The United States must do more to end China's wanton human rights violations and its persecution of Falun Gong and other religious minorities and prisoners of conscience. This resolution will raise awareness on the dire situation of human rights in China, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I also want to speak briefly on two Israel-related measures before us today. I was in Israel with my colleague Ted Deutsch when the bodies of three Israeli teens, Eyal, Gilad, and Naphtali, were found riddled with bullets, murdered by members of Hamas. We attended their funeral and sat Shiva with Naphtali's family, and we told them that the United States Congress would support Israel in its efforts to bring justice to the Frankel family. Authorizing funds for the Reward for Justice program is a step in the right direction. We must also help the entire Israeli nation as it remains under constant threat from Hamas and others, as we are seeing in Gaza today. And that's why Ranking Member Engel's bill to authorize more assistance to Israel for the Iron Dome recognizes the vital need for Israel to defend itself and protect its citizens against the rockets of Hamas. Since Operation Protective Edge began, Hamas has launched over 2,600 rockets at Israel's population centers, including Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. But Iron Dome has shielded millions of innocent Israeli civilians from Hamas's indiscriminate rocket attacks, and we must continue to support this vital program, and that's why this measure is so important. I'm also pleased to support two other human rights measures today, H.R. 3398, authorizing the Secretary of State and the Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development to provide assistance to support the rights of women and girls in developing countries, and House Resolution 683 on the need to protect religious minorities in Iraq from persecution by the terrorist group ISIL. Women and girls bear the lion's share of many global problems, as poverty, being victims of human trafficking, and having a lack of access to education. Empowering women and girls throughout the world to overcome the significant challenges that they face and to fulfill their potential as valuable members of society must be a priority for the United States. When the rights of women and girls are protected, societies are better off economically and socially, and the world is better off because of it. But we must also make the protection of religious minorities a priority as well. What we've seen in the past weeks in Iraq and throughout the Middle East, including the crucifixion of Christians, and most recently the ultimatum for Christians to pay taxes, leave, or face death, goes against every principle we stand for in our beloved country. This is a calamity that threatens the existence of all Iraq's Christians, and we must not allow it to continue. I urge my colleagues to support these measures before us today, and I thank you again, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member.
We go now to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I simply want to thank you and Ranking Member Engel for the way in which you have conducted not only this business meeting, but this committee. You've brought us together. You've tried to find common ground. You've carried everything out in a spirit of civility and bipartisanship, even when we do disagree. I think that sets a tone and a model for the Congress. I wish every committee would emulate what we've been able to achieve in this committee, and I just salute you for the style and tone in which you've comported yourself and set a standard for all the rest of us. I certainly join you and Mr. Engel in support for all of these resolutions, and I particularly want to thank my friend Ileana Ros-Lehtinen for her resolution on China. The persecution of minorities, Christian minorities, the persecution of indigenous groups like Falun Gong, and the odious practice of harvesting organs after summary justice and executions of prisoners' bodies, I just think is one of the most odious practices of any country in the world. And I salute Ms. Ros-Lehtinen for her leadership in this, and delighted to join with her in support of the legislation. One final thing, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shabbat and I are today introducing the Crimea Non-Recognition Act. It's a very simple bill, 4 paragraphs, but it directs Congress directing the U.S. government that it must not, cannot recognize in any way, shape, or form the illegal annexation of the Crimea. I'm going to be circulating that bill with Mr. Shabbat and a dear colleague. Any of our colleagues who'd like to get on the bill, just let us know. We'll be glad to give you a copy and put you on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We go to the Chairman of the Asia Subcommittee, Mr. Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this important markup today. And I would like to, before I get into my remarks on H.R. 3398, thank Mr. Connolly for his leadership on the Crimean Act. He came to me on that issue, and he's been the primary driver on it, and I commend him for that, working on it in a bipartisan manner. And I also would like to reiterate his comments about the way you have handled this committee. I know it means a lot more when it comes from somebody on the other side of the aisle, but Mr. Connolly is exactly right, which I wouldn't say all the time. But foreign affairs-wise—
It only hurts the first time, Steve.
I know. That's a good point. But on this committee, we do have a tendency to agree. I've seen you on another committee on TV sometimes. I have to say I don't necessarily agree with you there. But in any event, I do think, Mr. Chairman, that you have gone out of your way to make this committee actually work. You know, they talk about Congress being dysfunctional. This committee clearly is not, and I think does work in a bipartisan manner for the best interests of the country, and I think the American people are well served by that, and you're a driving force in that, so thank you. And I am supportive of all the measures before the committee today, and I'll just focus for a moment on H.R. 3398, which a number of other members have already mentioned, the Girls Count Act of 2013, which I introduced along with 44 of my colleagues, including about a dozen members on this committee, bipartisan. It's estimated that there are 230 million children across the globe whose birth was never recorded. And it's particularly acute in Africa. And the lack of a birth certificate restricts the ability of children from engaging in a number of fundamental rights, which we take for granted here in the United States. In order to address this issue, H.R. 3398 directs the Department of State and USAID to provide technical assistance to develop a birth registry birth certificate program. Helping to ensure that every child has a birth certificate will aid in a host of areas, including but not limited to access to voting rights, land tenure rights, health services, education, and will help to support efforts to thwart human and sex trafficking and aid in identifying displaced persons. H.R. 3398 would also aid in international adoption cases. Despite the fact that almost all countries require some type of birth registration prior to the government's issuance of identifying documents, like a birth certificate or a driver's license, nearly 1/3 of all children under the age of 5 worldwide have never had their births registered. As Chairman Royce already emphasized, for girls in particular, this lack of birth registration increases the barriers they face to receive education, health care, and it increases their vulnerability to trafficking and sexual exploitation. The legislation also authorizes the State Department and USAID to support programs that are designed to protect girls' legal rights, particularly economic and property rights, and to build legal and policy frameworks to prevent discrimination against women and girls and improve property and inheritance rights. Mr. Chairman, I support the committee amendment. I thank my colleagues for broad bipartisan support of the legislation. I urge an aye vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. We go now to Mr. Brad Sherman of California, ranking member of the Terrorism and Nonproliferation Subcommittee.
Well, first, I want to associate myself with the comments of the gentleman from Virginia in his lavish praise of, and well-justified praise of our chairman and ranking member. And I associate myself with that in the fervent hope that that will lead them to support my bills as they come before the committee. As to H.R. 4051, the bill introduced by Ted Cruz and supported by Senator Menendez in the Senate, which passed just a couple days ago, and which I introduced in this House. We do have an amendment in the nature of a substitute. It does move from requiring and mandating that a reward be given for information leading to the appropriate treatment of those who killed an American, Naftali Frankel. And so it does perhaps give the administration more leeway, but I think we ought to pass it in this form. It's the form that has the greatest consensus, not only in this room, but also with the administration. And I'm confident that the State Department will use this authority to seek the conviction of the criminals in this case. I support all the bills before us today, though I do want to bring to the committee's attention one concern I have about Resolution 281 dealing with China, and that appears on page 3, most of the way down the page, where it says, whereas researcher and journalist Ethan Gutmann estimates that approximately 65,000 Falun Gong adherents may have been killed for their organs from 2000 to 2008. If there's a general consensus, we could replace the words approximately 65,000 with the words large numbers of. And the reason I would suggest that, but I'm not going to put it in a formal amendment, is we've reached out to the human rights community, and we can't find anybody other than Ethan Gutmann that comes anywhere close to or is willing to support or this 65,000 figure. So while it is true that that is the figure given to us by Ethan Gutmann, I think the resolution would be better if we avoid using a figure that doesn't have general support in the human rights community. I've worked with the author on this a bit, and again, I'm not going to offer a formal amendment, and I'll yield to the chair.
And we can probably talk after the markup today then.
We could do that as well.
Okay. All right.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Other members seeking recognition? We have Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you for bringing to the committee a number of very important pieces of legislation. I want to thank Chairman Shabbat for his bill, Girls Count Act of 2014, documenting the birth of baby girls is extremely important. Having accountability, it does lead to, as he pointed out, a greater ability for other rights to be exercised as that girl grows older into a young woman. While the bill doesn't address it, I continue to be deeply concerned about the missing daughters worldwide. Some estimates put it as large as 200 million. Mira Wiesenthal has recently written a book in which he documented that there were about 164 million girls worldwide who have been killed through sex selection abortion. In Asia, I should say, it's 200 million worldwide. And the hope is that greater documentation, a greater affirmation of the girl child, because discrimination, gender discrimination, begins in the womb. So I thank him for his very important piece of legislation. I want to thank Chairman Emeritus Ross Layton for her very important bill, Res 281. As the chairwoman has done many times in the past, as I have done many times in the past with our Human Rights Committee. 20 years ago, we had a hearing on organ harvesting, and Harry Wu brought an individual here who was a member of the Chinese police, who he was smuggled out of China, and told how people were lined up and killed in order to procure organs from kidneys, whatever the need was. That person was killed in order to obtain that organ, which was then sold to someone else at a very, very high price. With the Falun Gong, as the chairwoman has pointed out, the Falun Gong have been targeted in an insidious way to harvest their organs. They are killed with impunity. And this resolution, I think, at long last, really puts us on record as saying clearly and unambiguously, this is something that the likes of Joseph Mengele did during, Dr. Mengele, during the worst days of the Nazi regime. So I want to thank her for that important. Juan Vargas, thank you for your resolution. We know that Christians are being targeted. ISIL certainly has been beheading, killing, and maiming Christians, raping Christian women. It is because they are Christians, it is genocide, and there has been a failure both on the Bush administration and now on the part of the Obama administration in speaking out clearly about this genocide against Christians, and I thank him for doing his very important resolution. And finally, on the issue of replenishing the protection of Israel by way of missiles, let's not forget that just 2 days ago, Khalid Mashal, leader of Hamas, told Charlie Rose when asked, do you want to coexist with the state of Israel? The Hamas leader said in a completely matter-of-fact manner, no. It is clear that Hamas doesn't want peace. It doesn't want reconciliation. It does not want coexistence. It wants only the total demise of Israel. And let me also remind everybody, and I would encourage everybody to reread the Hamas Charter, which is filled with anti-Semitic invective. Article 13, and I just quote this in pertinent part, initiatives in so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are a contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors. So says Article 13 of the Hamas Charter. So we are kidding ourselves if we think there's any possibility or probability that a negotiation can be engaged with people who are firing missiles, digging tunnels, terror tunnels. And again, this legislation, again, put by the ranking member, clearly says we need to replenish the Iron Dome capabilities. So the 500 missiles that have been shot down by that system, because these missiles are not going to stop anytime soon. Appreciate it, and I yield back.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Ted Deutsch, ranking member on Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you and Ranking Member Engel for once again working in a bipartisan fashion to bring up these good bills. And I associate myself with the many comments that have already been made praising your leadership at this committee and the way in which you conduct the markups and our hearings. I offer my support to all of today's measures, and I'll just make some brief comments on a few. First, I'd like to commend my friend, the ranking member, for his leadership on the Emergency Iron Dome Replenishment Act. I'm proud to co-sponsor this critical piece of legislation that will authorize the administration to provide additional support for Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system that is saving the lives of tens of thousands of Israeli civilians every single day. For the past 23 days, rockets have rained down from Negev to the Galilee, in Eilat and Sderot, in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv, Iron Dome has intercepted nearly 90% of rockets before they could strike their intended targets: homes, schools, airports, hospitals. It doesn't really matter where they land to the Hamas terrorists who fire them. The vital partnership between the United States and Israel in missile defense is the single reason Israeli civilians' lives aren't lost every single day, and hardly a day goes by that we don't hear messages of thanks from the Israeli people. I'd also like to thank Chairman Royce and Mr. Sherman for their work on the Naftali Frankel Rewards for Justice Act. It seeks to hold accountable those responsible for the heinous murder of an Israeli-American teen. Chairman Emeritus Ross Layton and I were in Israel to mourn with the Frankel family at Naftali's funeral and at their home. This family and the families of Eyal and Gilad deserve justice for this senseless act of terror. Finally, I offer my strong support to the resolution introduced by my friend Mr. Vargas, expressing the urgent need to protect religious minorities in Iraq. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant's march through Iraq has terrorized millions, with over 1,000 killed in June alone and nearly 2.8 million Iraqis displaced. The persecution of Christians in Mosul, including the violent removal of families from their homes and the threats to either pay taxes, convert, or die, has caused thousands to flee to Kurdish-protected areas. The Christian community in Iraq has existed and thrived for 2,000 years. Prime Minister Maliki has condemned the violence against Christians, but he must do more to protect them. And this Congress must speak out for religious tolerance and freedom in every corner of the world. Again, I'd like to thank all my colleagues for their work on today's measures, and I commend the Chairman for continuing to work in a bipartisan way. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. We now go to Mr. Ted Poe, Judge Ted Poe, who's Chairman of the Terrorism and Nonproliferation Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like first to talk about the persecution of religious minorities bill. I want to also commend Mr. Vargas for this legislation. In Iraq, especially where ISIL is, it's open season on Christians. Christians are being murdered, threatened, persecuted by this radical terrorist organization. The world needs to be aware that persecution of Christians occurs in many places, but right now it's occurring in Iraq. And I also want to thank the Chairman for his support of my amendment in this legislation that takes out the phrase Prime Minister Maliki's government, takes his name out. It shouldn't be his government. He's got to go. So that amendment will just say the Iraqi government instead of Prime Minister Maliki's government. I also want to comment on the legislation by the Chairman and the Ranking Member regarding Iron Dome. I was in Israel last year. I saw the operation of one of those batteries of Iron Dome. It needs to be clear to Americans and the rest of the world that the Iron Dome is a defensive missile system, a defensive missile system. It shoots down rockets that come into Israel, Iranian rockets that come from Gaza shot by Hamas. It is not an offensive weapons system. They're trying to defend their homeland from this terrorist organization, and Iron Dome works, and we need to support them, not with just more materials, but with verbally and politically, and let the world know the United States stands by Israel's right of self-defense. Hamas wants to destroy Jews, wants to destroy Israel. That's why they are attacking them. And every time there's a ceasefire by so-called world leaders, Hamas reloads. They get more missiles from Iran, and then they're ready for the next round of missiles to be fired into Israel. Hamas needs to be defeated. They are not a country. They are a bunch of thugs and terrorists who want to eliminate the Jews in Israel. They should be recognized as such, and they are a foreign terrorist organization. We need to deal with them accordingly. So I commend the Israelis for defending their country, because it is the absolute right of every nation to be left alone. And that's all the Israelis want to do, is be left alone, whether it's Hamas or whether it's Hezbollah or anybody else. We should support them materially, politically, and verbally for doing what any country ought to do, is to protect their people from criminals and terrorists. And I'll yield back with that, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking you and Ranking Member Engel for your continued commitment to working across the aisle and for marking up legislation before we recess for a month on these important subjects. I'm particularly glad to see forward momentum on a number of important bills, such as House Res 281, expressing concern over persistent and credible reports of systemic state-sanctioned organ harvesting, H.R. 3398, the Girls Count Act, and all of the other bills that we are considering today. In particular, I want to thank the Chairman and the Ranking Member for bringing before this committee the Emergency Iron Dome Replenishment Act. Like so many, I am deeply troubled by the ongoing violence in Israel and the Palestinian territories and strongly condemn Hamas's use of rockets against the State of Israel and its despicable use of civilians, including women and children, as human shields to protect their military assets. My thoughts and prayers are with all the innocent civilians who live in danger as long as this conflict continues. There is no question that Israel has a right to defend itself against any attack on its sovereignty and its people. One of the reasons why Israel has been able to keep its civilian death count comparatively low is due to the effectiveness of the Iron Dome anti-missile defense system, which intercepts dangerous rockets headed for Israeli population centers. Up until this point, the United States has provided over $700 million in foreign aid to Israel to support the Iron Dome. We've had the opportunity to see video of the Iron Dome at work intercepting rockets midair. Since the beginning of the escalation of violence in June, Iron Dome has intercepted about 500 rockets, approximately 90% of those rockets classified as threats, and the cost of these interceptions is very high, approximately $82,000. United States Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel supports Israel's request for $225 million in supplemental funding for Iron Dome. And I'm very proud that this committee is about to put some additional pressure on the appropriators to fund this life-saving program. At the same time, I think we should use this opportunity to recognize that it has become even clearer than ever before that the United States has a vested interest in supporting a swift resolution to this crisis. Violence and revenge are never the answer and will only serve to undermine efforts to advance peace and security in the region. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. We now go to Mr. Cotton of Arkansas.
I want to speak in support of the Emergency Iron Dome Replenishment Act on behalf of two groups, Arkansans and America's troops. Arkansans living in places like El Dorado, Texarkana, Mena, Huntsville would demand a system like Iron Dome if they were being attacked by Islamic terrorists across the borders of the state of Arkansas or invaded through tunnels coming into the state of Arkansas. They would demand that kind of swift action. They would also regret, as we all regret, civilian casualties, as we see today in Gaza. But we should all make no mistake that there is one party responsible for every single civilian casualty, and that's Hamas. Hamas commits double war crimes every day it attacks. It attacks Israeli civilians with indiscriminate rocket, missile, and mortar fire. And second, it sights its missiles and rockets and mortars at mosques and churches and synagogues and hospitals and schools. Hamas is not a country. It is not a legitimate negotiating partner. It is a terrorist organization that must be destroyed. And if world leaders want to stop civilian casualties, they would support Israel in its operation in Gaza. Or perhaps they would fly to Damascus and demand that Bashar al-Assad stop his genocide. Or maybe fly to Baghdad and demand action to stop the cleansing of Christians out of Mosul. Or perhaps maybe fly to Moscow, where Vladimir Putin is supplying thugs that are shooting civilian airliners out of the sky. Second, I want to support the Iron Dome Act on behalf of America's troops. In 2006, I was deployed with the 101st Airborne at Camp Falcon in Iraq. We took regular mortar and missile fire into our base. Unfortunately, there was little in the way of a defense against that fire. Our defense, jokingly, was big base, little bullet. One day, American troops are going to face that same kind of fire coming into bases, and the Iron Dome will be there to save them. For that, we should all be proud of and supportive of this bill, and we should be thankful to our Israeli partners.
We go now to Mr. Juan Vargas of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to add my voice to those that have commented how this committee, Mr. Chairman, is led by you and Ranking Member Engel in a bipartisan way. for the betterment of our country and our allies around the world. In particular, I want to thank you for bringing forth House Resolution 663 for a vote, and to thank my colleagues who have commented positively in this resolution. I introduced this resolution out of a deep concern for the plight of religious minorities in Iraq as the Sunni Islamist terrorist group ISIS began to expand its control of northwestern Iraq. In particular, after the fall of Mosul and the Nineveh plain region to these insurgents, the Iraqi Christian community began facing harassment, persecution, and displacement from their homes. The Iraqi Christian community has a long and rich history in the region, dating back thousands of years, and to lose their homeland during this humanitarian crisis would be a grave injustice. Since the fall of Saddam Hussein, over 50% of Iraq's Christians have fled their historical homeland. I've been in contact with leaders in the Chaldean American community who have shared many disturbing stories of targeted persecution against their friends and loved ones back in Iraq. After ISIS established its control over the northwestern Iraq and declared a caliphate, these Islamic terrorists warned Christians living under its jurisdiction to either convert to Islam, pay an outrageous religious tax, or be executed. Since this declaration, over 10,000 Iraqi Christians have packed their belongings and fled to neighboring communities in Kurdistan, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. The last 1,500 families to leave were robbed at an ISIS checkpoint, and there are reports that there are no more Christians living in Mosul and certainly no more masses. This mass exodus represents the largest forced displacement in the Middle East since the Armenian genocide in Turkey about 100 years ago. We cannot be silent in the face of this horrific crime against humanity, and I truly commend this committee for shedding a light on this important topic. This type of barbaric behavior is nothing new to ISIS in Syria. They burned churches and kidnapped bishops in the Christian city of Malula. Their brutal intolerance is also a break from a long tradition of the Muslim-Christian coexistence of the region. ISIS has also set its targets on other religious minorities, Shiites and unsupportive Sunnis. I strongly believe we must provide immediate protection and humanitarian assistance throughout the Nineveh plain to Iraq civilians fleeing this persecution. I also want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and express my strong support for all the legislation presented today, especially the Iron Dome Replacement Act, which authorizes additional assistance to Israel for their Iron Dome anti-missile defense system. I stand unequivocally with Israel as it defends its citizens from an onslaught of over 2,000 unprovoked rockets from Gaza since June 12, 2014. While the Iron Dome is used to protect innocent Israeli citizens from indiscriminate rocket fire, Hamas continues to cowardly use Palestinian civilians as human shields in order to protect their military arsenal. The atrocities occurring under Hamas are a clear violation of international humanitarian law and must be condemned by all nations. Thus, in light of the realities on the ground and Hamas's unwillingness to accept peace, I fully support Israel's ongoing operation to destroy Hamas's terror infrastructure. With the Iron Dome intercepting over 400 rockets in the last 6 weeks, I fully support the supplemental funding before us today that will further enable these capabilities. Israel remains our stalwart ally in the region, and we must support their efforts to protect their civilians. I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. And again, we thank you. We want to express our appreciation for your authorship of the Iraqi religious minority resolution here. If I could exercise the chairman's prerogative and make a very brief announcement here. I usually don't announce events for members, but tomorrow we have a very important briefing. Many on this committee have been focused on the human rights disaster in Syria, and tomorrow we'll have a truly exceptional briefing in this room with a Syrian defector who has taken tens of thousands of photos of the cataloged corpses of tortured Syrian political prisoners. And Caesar will testify in anonymity in fear of Syrian authorities, but he will deliver a powerful message that what is happening in Syria is an unmitigated humanitarian disaster. He wanted to come and tell this story, and he brings his photos. And I hope all members can attend. Thank you. And we go now to Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing us here today, but also let me associate myself with the previous remarks of many of my colleagues, thanking you, thanking the ranking member for how this committee has conducted its business, and not just the two of you. I think all of the members of the committee have shown the ability to work together in a bipartisan way, making sure that we as a committee, as a Congress, protect human interests around the globe, make sure we work towards better human rights and a more just world. So it's an honor to serve with you, but this has been an example, I hope, for the rest of the Congress of how a committee can work. I am honored and proud to support all of the measures before us today. I commend Mr. Chabot for the Girls Count Act. As Mr. Engel said earlier, I know my grandmother, who came when she was 5 from Kiev. Her birthday was marked by its association with Passover, but Passover moves in the calendar, so we never knew her exact birthday. Giving young women or women around the world that identity is crucial. I also want to commend Mr. Sherman for the Naftali Frankel Rewards and Justice Act. I think it is crucial that we bring the perpetrators of that heinous crime to justice and as soon as possible. Let me touch a little more deeply on the Iron Dome Replenishment Act. I had the privilege last year to visit Israel and visit the Iron Dome, meet with many of the officers, commanders in charge of the batteries. Sitting at lunch with them, I was next to an officer who shared a story how he was a relatively new father, and before Iron Dome, he sat during an air raid alert in a bomb shelter, holding his newborn son to his chest and thinking of the threat and concerns, not just for his son, but for Israelis throughout the country. A couple years later, he was able to join the troops that are manning the Iron Dome system that was created in Israel but developed with U.S. financial support and wouldn't be possible without our support. And he told how in 2012, being in charge of an Iron Dome battery, how the difference in feeling, protecting his son, but knowing he was also protecting all Israelis throughout the country from the ongoing assault of rockets from Gaza. Since Israel unilaterally and completely withdrew from Gaza in 2005, 10,000 rockets have been fired indiscriminately at civilian targets inside Israel. Since just July 2008, over 2,000 rockets have been fired at Israel. Air raid sirens ring out on average every 10 minutes, causing concern, causing worry, causing unnecessary and unremitting stress. Hamas is not shooting at military targets. Hamas is aiming directly at civilians, at homes, at schools, at hospitals. Hamas is acting in violation of international law by targeting civilians in Israel, but also by using civilians in Gaza as human shields to protect their rockets. The world needs to speak out. I am pleased to be joined in a letter to the UN by over 100 of my colleagues calling for those rockets, those stockpiles of rockets, to be eliminated in Gaza. But until they are eliminated, Iron Dome is shielding Israelis by reducing the impact of rockets and saving lives, not just in Israel, but in Gaza, by allowing Israel to carefully and selectively target, knowing that their citizens are protected by the Iron Dome. I strongly support and I'm pleased to be a co-sponsor of the bill making sure that the United States continues to fund this crucial weapon system, protection system. I'd also like to speak directly to my good friend Juan Vargas and thank him for introducing the bill protecting religious minorities in Iraq. Mosul, at its peak not too long ago, had 60,000 Christians. It was a vibrant community. It was an important community. To hear today that there are no longer any Christians living in Mosul, as the world sits quietly by, is simply unacceptable. Religious minorities everywhere in the world must be protected. I am proud that this body today is standing up and speaking out in a strong voice, protecting religious minorities, and again declaring our support for people around the world and working to make this a better place. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Ms. Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I wanted to say that I support all the bills and resolutions before us today, and I, like my colleagues, I thank the chair, the ranking member, for your bipartisan efforts, and also my colleagues for their bipartisan efforts. As to the terror attacks by Hamas on Israel, the Iron Dome will go a long way to help. With that said, Israel's defense must be more than the Iron Dome, and I'd like to add a comment in this regard, Mr. Chair. The situation in Israel and Gaza is tragic and sorrowful. Too many innocent men, women, and children on both sides of the border dying and suffering because of the terrorist actions of Hamas. I know that a permanent ceasefire is what decent, humane people would eventually hope for, but it cannot be unconditional. We cannot ask Israel to cease fire while Hamas maintains its infrastructure of destruction. And for that reason, Mr. Chair, I want to reaffirm my support and join my colleagues' support for Israel's right to defend its citizens, not only from the rocket attacks, but also from Hamas's tunnels of terror. No nation would accept the perpetual threat of terrorists launching attacks and kidnappings from underground tunnels. Since the beginning of Operation Protective Edge of the Israeli Defense Force, they've identified 32 sophisticated underground attack tunnels, each with multiple shafts and openings. The tunnels were built by Hamas for the sole purpose of infiltrating Israel in order to murder and kidnap Israeli civilians and soldiers. Last week, 10 Hamas gunmen emerged from a tunnel near Israel's kibbutz near Am and killed 4 Israeli soldiers before they would kill themselves in return fire. Hamas militants have infiltrated Israel 6 times this month through hidden tunnels. Officials have reported that tunnels are stocked with tranquilizers, handcuffs, syringes, ropes, and other materials used for abductions. The tunnels also hold vast quantities of explosives and other military equipment meant to be used in mass casualty attacks. It's shocking to learn that Hamas has spent upwards of $100 million on these tunnels at the expense of Palestinians in Gaza. The Hamas leadership cares more about killing Israelis than it does about helping Palestinians. Construction materials delivered by Israel, meant for Palestinian civilians, have been systematically diverted by Hamas. Since the beginning of 2014 alone, more than 4,000 trucks carrying 181,000 tons of gravel, iron, cement, wood, and other supplies has passed through Israel's Kerem Shalom crossing in Gaza, yet instead of building schools, clinics, and homes, Hamas has used much of the material to build tunnels aimed at annihilating Israel. And as I have said before, and I've heard my colleagues say today, Hamas is to blame for the violence in Gaza and Israel, and they must be stopped. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Frankel. Any other members seeking recognition? Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on the items considered en bloc. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the measures considered en bloc, H.R. 3398, H.R. 5041, H.R. 5235, House Resolution 281, and House Resolution 683 are agreed to as amended. Without objection, each of the measures as amended is ordered favorably reported as a single amendment in the nature of substitute. Staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes, and that concludes our business for today. And I want to thank our ranking member, Mr. Engel, and all of our committee members for their contributions and assistance on these markups. This committee is adjourned.
I will. Here, Josh, make sure I do that.
Thank you. That was a powerful speech.
Hey, I got the memo.